Hello there, my name is Dr. Salim Javed and we have been talking about different story formats, and here is where we are talking about 7-point story structure, and in which we talked about that the beginning, that the end, if you sort out your end, it is easy for you to start the story, and then once you sort out the story is beginning from end to beginning, then the midpoint, then we were talking about plot turn one, which is basically about when you introduce your character story's central conflict, which is like in the first half. Now let's talk about the second half, which is plot turn two, and which is basically grasping victory from the jaws of defeat. It occurs between the story's midpoint and the conclusion, so it is basically happening in the second part. The protagonist will decide and set out to carry it out. Now there is a bold move on the part of character, perhaps the most important choice that they will ever make. Now in terms of plot point 2, or at this point the protagonist should have acquired at least some piece of information necessary to end the fight. He may not have this information in the first half, but he needs to have this specific information at plot turn 2, because now you are moving towards resolution, which is, or before that you are moving to climax. So you should know everything about how story can be concluded, and that becomes a responsibility rather for plot turn 2 to have it all in itself. Now last but not the least, the hero experience what Dan Wells calls the power is in you. Now this is something very interesting, to be very honest. Though it has been overly it has been overly translated into melodrama in Indian cinema, when the protagonist is beaten down out and there is somebody shouting, okay, you have to get up, tujhe teri maa ki kasam or behan ki kasam, all that. But it has been indicating that the power is in you, and the protagonist muster its courage and stands up, and without any hope goes and defeats the antagonist. So it is basically the realization of latent abilities. They learn how to channel their power for good as well. Now this is basically, it was basically plot turn 1 and 2. Now let's talk about pinch. Now sometimes when you start practicing these terms, it becomes very difficult to memorize these things. Now what does pinch do? Pinch 1 and pinch 2. What does pinch? Pinch 1 is part of the first half and pinch 2 is part of the second half. Now if I may say, that the purpose of pinch, is to give hardship to your character. Now, again, there is a proverb, only the heel knows where the shoe pinches, so it is the same pinch. So there are two pinch in this specific format. One comes in first half and the second comes in second half. Now, the pinch is basically, it talks about how there are specific opportunities which can create a point of pressure, for your character. Now, so pinch is basically how you will be pressurizing your protagonist in first half, and pinch 2 is how you will be pressurizing your character in second half. Obviously, there will be a difference when between the first pinch and the second pinch, and the difference is of degree. You cannot pressurize your character the way you will pressurize your character in the second half. You cannot do the same in the first half, otherwise the film has to cut short. Or if you give him a pinch of that magnitude, then the pinch 2 has to be higher than that. As I said, that I was talking to one of my colleagues, and I said that when we talk about story formats, it is always that if your character is rich in the end, then in the beginning of the story your character is poor. Now imagine a story where it is like, suppose a long film, and full length feature film is 90 minutes and above, so that is CV FC definition, 90 minutes and above. Now think of a story, how we are trained, how Indian writers are trained. This is like very, very, very important to understand. Indian story writers and screenplay writers, or for that matter majority of screenplay writers in India and abroad, they are trained that as I am talking about different story format, that your character is rich, it means that he was poor in the beginning. So your if professor accepts that Rancho is best, because of his unconventional thinking and because he was able to save the newborn baby of his elder daughter, it means, in the beginning he is not loved by by virus. Now this is a balance that you don't like it, in the end you like it, and you like it so much that you want Rancho as your son-in-law. Now this is how we are trained, this is how Indian story writers are trained: poor or not likable, rich and likable. This is the extent of our imagination. Now think of a story where your character is poor in the beginning, not in the end, but somewhere as the story is developing, he becomes rich. Now you would argue that, Salim sir, how this is possible? He is poor, he is rich. That is mean, it is one story and the story should end here. But I say no, let's develop a story. It's a challenge for us also, that your character is poor, then he becomes rich, then he becomes poor again, then he becomes rich, then he becomes poor again, and then he becomes rich, and it's one story. You would fight with me and say, no sir, Salim sir, it cannot be one story, it is basically three stories, and this is how we are taught in our screenplay writing classes or in story formats. This cannot be the case, and how would you do that in 2 hours? When I said it is only, the limit is of 2 hours, it can be an entire OTT series. It can be one season of a OTT program. I am not giving you a condition that this is only one story. But interesting thing is, now the most challenging thing is, which I'll be talking during this lecture, that what is your setup to have this sort of a story, and how you as a writer, or I as a writer, will convince people. Forget people comes late in the process, producer and the entire creative team, to make it. Because all we know is that if your character is stupid in the beginning, he has to be a worldly wise in the end. This is how, be that Bahubali, it has been divided into 2 films, that as the film starts, there is a lady who is carrying the baby, and he's not known by anybody. A tribe adapts him, and by the end of the film, after 4 hours almost, he is the king of the biggest empire known at that point of time. Now this is how we have been dealing, this is how we have been writing. But what if a story is woven, not created, woven? What if a story is woven which has poor, rich, again poor, again rich, again poor, and finally again rich? Even Buddha, once rich, when he got the state of enlightenment, he left everything. So from rich to poor, I mean not in in a derogatory sense, but he is more enlightened than rich in the life process, and there is a entire philosophy, क्षण भंगुरता की जब वो बात करते हैं, so theory of momentariness when he talks about it. So think of something. This is how this is how we broaden our horizon. that what has been taught, we duplicate, not duplicate only, we triplicate actually the same process in one story, still convince the audience. That's what now the writing will be all about. There has to be such a setup. It is very difficult to create this story. Let me warn you, it is very, very difficult to create this kind of a story if your setup does not support the story. And I'll tell you how setup supports the story during the lecture. That setup is as important as the story in terms of you believing in the story. Now, this is pinch point 1. Now, let's talk about pinch point 2. Now, pinch point 2 occurs in the second half of the story, and this is tougher than the pinch 1. Now, the protagonist has reached the point of no return. Now, point of no return is something that I have been talking about in different story formats differently. So you have to find out what is a point of no return. No hope remains. Wells offered the following recommendation for round 2 of the pinch. The hero's plan fail. The hero's mentor dies, and the hero loses everything. Now this is something which reminds me of Diwar. Why me? Why me? So when he loses everything, and then the dark night of the soul, as I remember, it is from Black Snyder beat sheet. So when you're talking about the dark night of the soul, where hero has lost everything, where the mentor has died, or some very important person has died, or the protagonist is completely shattered. He is all over the place and he is not able to gather himself. So that pinch 2 has to be that specific stage where there is no hope left. Now, this is something completes the non-linear format of Dan Wells' 7-point story structure, where he says to follow it non-linearly, so not in a non-linear fashion. So it talks about resolution, which is basically the end part of the structure. Then he jumps on to hook. From hook he jumps on to midpoint, and from midpoint he jumps on to plot point 1, which is in the first half. Then he jumps on to plot point 2, which is in the second half. Then he jumps on to pinch 1, which is in the first half. Then he jumps on to pinch 2, which is the second half. Now, this is how Dan Wells' 7-point story structure works, but it is not all. So this is that, okay, you understand what has been said, but when you have said something, ironic thing about saying is that saying is never all. This is how I am thinking of right now, the Gestalt theory, where the sum of all is greater than the all. So though he has said it this much, but there is more to it. And what it is more, let's talk about it. Dan Wells, after this story structure, talks about 5 very important things. He says that your characters should be round characters, your environment should be rich, there has to be a subplot that I was saying that understanding subplot is very important in terms of writing. There are good definitions about what is a subplot, what is a plot, what is a story, what is a screenplay, how many pages will be there, what margin should be left on both sides, what margin should be on the upper side and the lower side, where the page number should be printed, how much centimeter space should be left between 2 lines, what is the gap, and all these things. But trust me, when it comes to subplot, whatever we read or you have read or you will be reading, understanding about a specific topic is always whether you can experience experience it or not. If you cannot internalize the process, if you cannot reproduce the process, it is not only about internalizing. I always say it is not only about reproducing it. It is, again, if you can do with these two steps and can reach to the people's heart and they are struck by it, there is where understand that you have started learning the craft. When you read it, when they read it, when they can imagine it, it involves a lot of things, the way how simply you write, how eloquently you write, how precisely you write, what imagination you are weaving. There are a lot of things working on this specific format. So subplot, I'll give you examples also by how subplot works, what is a subplot, and how do you identify that this is a subplot or this is one of the subplots in the story, how it is driving plot, Then very interesting thing he talks about is the ice monster prologue, and then try and fail, cycles. Now, he basically talks about in this specific order, but I'll be explaining subplot in the end, or if possible, then in the next video, but because that depends. First, I'll be explaining about what different kind of characters are there. Why do you fall in love with a character? I was talking, yesterday only we were talking, so we talked about a lot of things. Now, when he was saying that recently Jawan is released, and to understand the aura of Shah Rukh, you really have to, study him really well, because he is also one of the actors like many others, but his screen presence generate a very different sort of a magic, how do you define that? How do you measure that? One day there will be a definition, and one day definitely there will be a measurement. Doesn't matter if after 50 years or so. Now, let's first talk about characters. Now, character, the best definition of character is they are the one through which you say your story. I cannot produce a better definition than this. Though there is like a lot of very good definitions, very written by or created by very stalwart individuals, very creative people. But for me, the characters are those through which you say your stories. They can be living and they can be non-living also. They can be real people, they can be pure imagination. So if Mahendra Bahubali or Rancho is living, then Wally is a non-living character. If when you are creating an autobiography, he is a factual figure, and some can be a fictional figure. So characters are those individuals through which you are saying your stories, or you're saying your story. So they are characters. But obviously, if we are not talking about Scandinavian structure of story format, which I'll be talking about, then in Hollywood or in Indian sort of storytelling tradition, there is always a protagonist. There cannot be 4 protagonists, there cannot be 5 protagonists. Some more important, some less important, but everybody is playing the role of a protagonist. Everybody is a protagonist of his or her own story. In Scandinavian story structure format, they intertwine and they cross each other at a specific point, or their area of interest is basically pulling them, and there is a crossroad of different characters at different points in the story, and they all are important. Like we do that sort of an experiment, like Life in a Metro, where every character is an important character. So it is not that we do not experiment in Scandinavian story structure, but majority of Indian and as well as Hollywood films are single protagonist journey, and even the hero's journey is also about one hero going through a different ordeal, and and then coming back to ordinary world. So characters through which you are saying your story, and there are different ways. Right now I am talking about specific story format, right now 7-point story structure, and just it gave me an opportunity to talk about the Scandinavian story structure format. There is Indian structure, there is also Indian story structure format. I'll be talking about different nations story structure once I am done with some prominent story structures. Now let's talk about round character, as we are talking about round characters. Now there are 4 distinct kind of characters, of which round character are merely one. However, let's define defining a round characters is something that you are saying that an individual has several facets and a genuine personality. Now several facet and a genuine personality, technically talking about that he can dance, he can fight, he can do comedy, he can do action, he can be sober, he can be very childish, he can be a monk, he can be a killer. So these are the different facets of a character who has got a genuine personality. Now make sure that when we are talking about round character, the protagonist and secondary characters have depth. When I talk about character arc, there is, indirectly you're talking about the depth, and are not, they are, they have depth, they are not caricatures. Now there is a difference between cartoon and a caricature, and you really have to understand that they are not a direct a direct copy of someone and who is reacting differently in different situation. Round characters are basically complex and has different dimensions in their personality. The viewer sees them in a variety of situations because they are well developed in all sort of things. They are realistic, therefore it is not that easy to define a round character, because when you the term itself is very very ambiguous, that when you say round, it has got more dimensions than other different characters. When describing the traits of a round character, it is important to back up our understanding with reference to behavior, events, and descriptions in the story. Other people may interpret these characters as different, but they are equally valid in every individual way. Now let's talk about dynamic characters. A dynamic character undergoes a permanent change in personality and attitude. Now it is not only about this specific video lecture which you are seeing through CEC-UGC online program. The important thing is that it helps you in your studies also, it helps you in your life also. So when you say that, suppose if I ask you what is research, or suppose if I ask you what is development communication, there has to be one simple answer ready as a student with you. Reason being that one simple answer acts as a key in understanding and opening different dimensions of that particular topic. Now suppose if I say dynamic character, so dynamic character undergoes a permanent change. Now this is very important to remember, that he goes through a permanent change in personality and attitude. It is important to evaluate the plausibility. Now plausibility is a slightly difficult word, so plausibility is believability. Now this believability is very very easy to understand but difficult to create. Now believability, if you have seen the promo of Kalki, okay, it is not that you have not seen, but it is very interesting to see that sort of a setup, or that sort of a mounting. I always call it mounting. That sort of a setup, that sort of a mounting in Indian context. Now the success of the story, now the success of the film depends on how authentically You have created the setup. Have you given the historical validation to this setup? Now, when I talk about historical validation, I always bring in a very good film, Tumbad. If you have seen Tumbad. Tumbad, the success of Tumbad, if ever anybody analyze, the success of Tumbad is in its historical grounding. How well they have woven a historical reference which may or may not be true, but is believable. That, okay, if you do not know the story, but something like this must have happened in the past. That's why they are talking about this. So the element of believability, makes the setup authentic. If Kalki has got its setup authentic, that film will work. And if it does not get its setup believability, the element of believability, doesn't matter how much money you put, doesn't matter what quality of VFX you put, it will not take off. Because what audience is looking for is the believability. Yes, something like this can exist. And how do you make your audience believe that something like this happens? How well you historically plant your film makes it believable. So a good setup is all about believability. In the next video, we will talk about subplots and many other things. Thank you very much.